Just welcome everyone to the School and Prison Pipeline lecture series, or lecture in the lecture series. My name is Sam Song, and just a couple of housekeeping items. Just a FYI, as you know, we are recording this session for use afterwards. And at the end of the session, we definitely have a lot of time for Q&A. And so we're really looking forward to that portion as well. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself and the panelists. My name's, again, Sam Song. I'm a professor and the program coordinator of the school psychology programs here at UNLV in the College of Education. I've been a school psychologist and educator for 15 years. I'm the past president of the Division of School Psychology in the American Psychological Association. And my interest is in culturally responsible mental health practices in schools, including restorative justice. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Patrice Leverett. She'll be starting us off in terms of the lecture. She is an assistant professor of school psychology at UNLV in the College of Education. She served in the field of education for over 15 years as an elementary educator, school psychologist, and training supervisor. Her work examines the impact of implicit bias on learning outcomes for students. And she's been recently recognized by the Society of School Psychology as an early career scholar for her work in this area. And she has a number of grants funding her work. So really lucky to have her here. Dr. Samuel Scavella is an educational leader with 28 years of school-based and district-level experience implementing systemic structures and processes to ensure organizational effectiveness, high performance, equity, and accountability by utilizing research and evidence-based practices. For nearly 3 decades, Dr. Scavella has served children and youth in urban schools. He's been a teacher and assistant and principal and high school principal for 20 years. He's currently serves as an assistant superintendent and leads the Equity and Diversity Education Department in the Clark County School District. Dr. Scavella also co-chairs the School Justice Partnership with a focus on ensuring safe schools with productive classrooms where all students are college and career ready upon graduation. He maintains that children and youth are our greatest investments who must be challenged and nurtured to unlock the treasures of kindness, honesty, productivity, and service. And so also very lucky and privileged to be working and presenting alongside Dr. Scavella here. All right, I'm just going to do a brief overview of our presentation today. We're going to talk about what is the school to prison pipeline, addressing implicit bias, restorative justice in schools, and then school practice and the law. All right. Without further ado, to introduce Dr. Patrice Leverett.
Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about this term, the school to prison pipeline. And the reason that we're talking about this is that we're seeing trends in terms of discipline, how we're engaging students in schools that seems to be impacting not only their academic performance, but their willingness to kind of stay engaged in the educational process. What's more, we're seeing that there are differential outcomes for students from particular groups. Today, we'll talk a little bit about the differences we see across race, and, ethnicity, and gender, but just kind of across the board, we're seeing some differences in outcomes. So just so that we have the same term, I want to define the school to prison pipeline. So the school to prison pipeline is a term used to refer to the correlation or the direction of change that we see between school removal for suspensions or expulsions to later incarceration numbers in the juvenile justice system, right? The likelihood of having police contact or negative police contact, I should say, over the course of time. So some of the things that we notice with the school to prison pipeline is that many of the individuals who were removed from the school environment whether it be for suspension or expulsion, are more likely to be students with special needs, right, having learning disabilities, with a history of poverty, a history of abuse or neglect. Right, and so some of these pieces would be better addressed through additional mental health or educational supports. What we also notice in terms of these trends is that the individuals who are likely to be removed from classroom differ based on race and ethnicity. So we are seeing higher numbers of expulsion, particularly for African American youth, Latinx youth, and Indigenous populations. While the data suggests that suspensions and expulsions do not increase educational outcomes for learners, they're still widely used across districts as a way to address some of the behavior challenges that we see in the school environment. But we also know that increasing academic and behavioral interventions, right, those evidence-based interventions that we're seeing in schools has a better outcome in terms of supporting these learners, as does addressing school climate and mental health services. So we would see more of an impact on some of the performances if we were able to integrate some of those things. The other piece that we want to point out here has to do with kind of why we are seeing some of these trends in the first place. So part of the reason we're seeing some of this connection in terms of kind of this push out that we're seeing in terms of students has to do with kind of the history of policy and change over the course of time. So part of what we're seeing was an increase in what's considered to be zero tolerance policies or practices. And so this idea of zero tolerance really came about kind of in the Reagan administration. And the idea was if you take this broken window approach, right, if somebody commits a kind of a smaller crime or infraction and you address it right away, right, you the very first time there's an infraction, you address it right away and you just address it kind of severely. The idea is that it would discourage anyone from wanting to engage in those behaviors again. They use the same policy for drug use and distribution. Right, and so the idea was to criminalize infractions and increase kind of police contact for individuals who were committing certain crimes. What we're finding over time is a number of things. One, the zero tolerance practices within the kind of the policing community were used differently for different communities, right? And so we found that harsher penalties for certain types of drugs that were found in kind of more minority or lower SES populations were being penalized at a much higher rate than drug use or infractions in kind of higher socioeconomic status areas or areas that had a kind of a larger white population, right? So we saw differential kind of use of some of these policies and practices, which led to kind of a larger number of people who are minoritized, right, coming from those Black and Brown communities, coming from those lower socioeconomic status, being represented in the prison system, right? It kind of trickled over. We talk about that policy because that same framework was then applied in the education context, right? That same kind of the first time you have an infraction, we are going to kind of give a more severe punishment over time, which could include things like suspension and expulsion, in attempts to curtail certain behaviors. And so as a result, we've seen 2 times the suspension rates since the 70s as we do today. Also, as a result of that, we're seeing those same kind of differences in terms of which communities are being represented in those infractions, falling along those same lines, right? Falling along socioeconomic status, falling along race, falling along gender. And so as we're seeing some of those trends, we're seeing the same outcomes, right? So we're seeing more students of color being removed from the classroom and asked to kind of stay at home or be in other spaces. In fact, Black students are 3 times as likely to be suspended or expelled than white students. What that also means is that we're seeing an increase of police contact for those students as well, right? As we see kind of more disciplinary issues being addressed by school officers and less by classroom teachers, then that police contact, that negative police contact, right? I want to focus on it being the negative side of that, is increasing over time. Right. And so we're seeing that 31% of Black students represent school-related arrests, right, which is much larger than we've seen in the past. Also, we're seeing that as students are being removed from the classroom, we're seeing that they're being removed for more subjective behaviors if they are Black and brown than objective behaviors, which we see typically for white students. So subjective behaviors include things like disrespect, right? Something that is really hard to define because it's so culture bound. It's so personal to the individual. And because it's so hard to define, it's harder then to kind of address it as an issue. The category is kind of so broad. That's the area where we're seeing more Black and brown students being represented and being suspended for. That's less likely for white students. Right. So the last thing that we want to think about is kind of the negative consequences that we see with school removal. So while we know that academic supports, behavior interventions have been there's more evidence to suggest their effectiveness than suspension and expulsion, we are still seeing suspension and expulsions used in schools. As we increase the number of suspensions and expulsions, we're also seeing this kind of negative impact for the individuals who are receiving that, right? Obviously, if you're being suspended or expelled, you're not getting the same access to educational opportunity, right? So we're seeing a drop in academic performance and just general engagement. We're also seeing that as you are more likely, when you are suspended or expelled, we're seeing higher rates of dropout, right? Because that engagement is not there. That feeling of connection to the environment, right, is not being fostered or facilitated when you're out of the classroom environment. And then we're also seeing, again, that higher level of police contact and more likely to engage in activities outside of school that make students unsafe, right, because they're not within the classroom environment. Right. And so what we want to focus on in today's talk is some strategies that we can begin to think about to address this persistent crisis that we're seeing in terms of increased police contact for juveniles over the course of time.
Thank you. So as Dr. Leverett has just shared, there's a cultural or racial ethnic component to the school to prison pipeline. And so we want to discuss then the importance of culturally responsive practice. And at the core of culturally responsible practice is the dual factor model of school mental health promotion. And one of the core issues and ideas is that learning does not just occur by itself, but in conjunction with overall wellness. And wellness includes mental health and the promotion of strengths. And so this intersection is really what needs to be stressed in schools. And this is not necessarily new information, but what we want to do is just remind folks of this, and has a long history in the mental health promotion field, and especially as it's applied to schools. And so then culturally responsible practice is a newer model that builds upon culturally responsive practices. And so similarly then, a couple of points to stress. It focuses on strengths and assets of the individual child. And so every child, no matter who they are or where they've been, everyone has strengths. I believe that. Everyone, the panelists believes that. Do you believe that? Well, then you got to go and think about what they are. Okay. And, we all have been in schools. And so it's a natural human tendency to, when you get frustrated with someone, right, that maybe you're going to focus on deficits. And so the strength and asset-based approach is really critical, okay? And so that number two is looking at the strengths in the child's community as well. So this includes the child's family, the child's neighborhood, and extended family and resources. And so the premise here is that every family has strengths as well. And so if you look at number 1 and 2, then combined, it's really saying, hey, we really need to identify the strengths, assets of the child and their families, neighborhoods from a cultural perspective, okay? And just a quick illustration of that is a strength at home may not be considered a strength at school because the school often has a different set of values and expectations. Because there's 30 kids, right? We're there to, the teachers are there to do some of their work and teaching, obviously. And so because of these differential expectations and cultural differences, then that's the piece that we really need to bridge and address. Number 3 is professional ownership. And so culturally responsive practice has been really important in the field. This newer model is wanting to really say, hey, we are all professionals and we really need to own this. Okay, no more shifting blame, no more saying, well, do I need to be responsive culturally or not? It's saying we all need to take ownership. It needs to be a part of who we are and what we do as a matter of ethics. Okay, so if you're a teacher, if you're an administrator, a psychologist, or a counselor, including cultural responsive practice is the culture responsible thing to do professionally. Okay, and so that's what that focuses on. And the last one is advocacy and systems change. And so while the previous 1 and 2 is there, it exists in culturally responsive practices, there has not been as much of an emphasis on advocacy and systems change. And what I mean here is, in fact, the issues of oppression that occur in schools, including racism, sexism, classism, and their intersectionality. Okay, so it's a clear identification, explicit acknowledgement that we need to address these oppressive systems in schools and create interventions. And so with that, then number 4 is suggesting that we need to focus on population-based change in schools. And so this has been a huge movement for a number of years with the beginning of positive psychology and MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, where we need to focus on the school from a public health perspective. What can we do for all kids? Okay, and then which kids need more support? And so undergirding our interventions and ideas is these assumptions of this model. And so then today, as Dr. Leverett mentioned, we're going to focus on implicit bias and restorative justice as ways to address the school prison pipeline. Not the only ways, but 2 very important ways, and ones that have been getting a lot of popularity. And so it's important to address those. And so again, introducing Dr. Leverett.
Okay, so much of the work that I do with schools and school districts has to do with thinking about implicit bias. And so let's start with a definition of that. So implicit bias are attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decision-making. It's kind of these snap judgments or these involuntary decisions that we make, even without our awareness or intentional control. Our judgments or these biases can be favorable when we're evaluating others, but they can also be unfavorable, causing negative outcomes for the individuals who are impacted. Right, and so some of the important things that we need to know going into this is that we all have bias. There is no one group that's exempt. Hey, I'm from this group, I can't be biased because, I experience bias on a regular basis. And fortunately for all of us, we're impacted on a daily basis by different cues that we're getting from society, right? How we're treated, how we're taught to treat other people is all going to be impacted by these cues, these subtle cues, these systematic kind of pieces that are happening over the course of time. And we're just kind of infiltrated by them. Right. So part of what we do is just acknowledge that. It comes up in any number of ways. When you walk into a room full of people you don't know, who do you sit next to? Right. How do you decide where you're going to sit in the room? More than likely, we choose to sit next to people who look like us or remind us of somebody we know. Right. That comes from that place of implicit bias. Right. These ideas we have about who is more comfortable. What doctors we select, we think about things either explicitly or implicitly, like gender, ethnicity, where someone was trained. who we hire within our schools or within our community settings. We're going to take a look and have certain preferences, whether we say them out loud or not, about what schools they attended, what neighborhoods they worked in, if they have an accent, right? Things that maybe we don't explicitly say, but trigger certain thoughts or feelings within our mind. Right? We make these decisions based on these unconscious judgments. And part of our job, right, in implicit bias training or implicit bias work is to first acknowledge that's happening, right, that happens for all of us. And then take an opportunity to kind of reflect on that so that we can mitigate that bias or change some of the outcomes of that bias by acknowledging them and moving forward. Okay, so we see the impact of school-based decision-making, the impact of implicit bias on school-based decision-making. Particularly, as we mentioned earlier, we're seeing some of those differences based on race, ethnicity, and gender. Right. So as mentioned before, we're seeing differential outcomes between Black students and white students. Black students are less likely than white students to be placed in gifted programming. Teachers give more encouragement to white students than to students of color. And teachers ask more questions and give more precise feedback to boys versus girls. Right. And so while if you ask any of these teachers, hey, why are you doing this thing? First, they would be shocked to hear that is happening, right? Because it's not their intention. But it is something that we're seeing a trend across, on average, across teachers, right? So first, we bring awareness to that, and then we start to unpack how to address that. Okay, so we're seeing that this is impacting kind of expectation for student achievement. So K-12 teachers have lower expectations and display less social comfort with Black students and white students, right? And we know that relationship, right, between students and their teachers is super important to help with engagement, to help with connectivity between other students, to help with student self-efficacy, right, their belief in being able to be successful, right? And so if we're noticing that discomfort is high, right, then we begin to intervene at that place, right? How do we build more comfortable relationships between people from various backgrounds and with different expectations? Right. We also see that in terms of tutors, right? When we're bringing in outside community providers to help support students. Tutors implicit bias when teaching Black participants resulted in greater anxiety of the tutor, a poor lesson quality from the tutor, and lower test performance when we took a look at tutors' interactions with Black learners. Okay, so today we're also thinking about specifically discipline. So there was a Stanford University study that asked teachers to review the same records, right? So we gave discipline records to this group, and they had two types. One was with a stereotypically white name, and another had a stereotypically Black name, right? And the idea was, are we still making the same decisions, even if we have different cues about the race or ethnicity of the students? So even though the records were the same, the outcomes were different. Black students were more likely to be viewed as punished as troublemakers. Black students received more severe punishment, right? The recommendations were to give more severe punishment than white students. And they viewed the pattern of behavior as problematic if the student was Black. Even though the information that they were provided was generally the same, their decision-making was different, right? And again, if you ask them before starting this study, do you think you would treat your Black students any differently than white students? Of course, everyone would say no. But what we're seeing here is that isn't actually mapping out in the decision-making across the board. Okay, so there are a number of ways that we can intervene for implicit bias. The first piece of that, as I mentioned, is just acknowledging that bias exists. There are a number of different ways that we can kind of get a better understanding of implicit bias and how it interacts in our daily lives. One example is the implicit association test. And so if you have an opportunity to ever look them up, it gives you an opportunity to take a look at certain aspects of your perspective on parts of society, whether that be gender or age, race, ethnicity, kind of a number of categories. And then based on this test, it gives you a sense on if you have if you're more drawn towards one group versus the other, or if you have a more reverse reaction to one group versus the other. And the important piece about that is kind of recognizing that that's happening and thinking about if it's making any impact on your decision and kind of slowing your thinking process down about why that might be. The other piece we recommend is always increasing professional development on implicit bias and any of these topics that we're talking about today. We are constant learners, right? I have 80 million degrees and I'm constantly looking for different ways to increase my understanding, to learn more about some of these areas, because in the same way that we are all learning here together, I'm always looking for different ways to learn. It's part of our growth process. We also want to increase our exposure to communities that are outside of our cultural norms, right? To help us build respect and empathy. For some of us, that may be going to a religious institution that's different from our own, or spending time in cultural and community centers from a community that you are not familiar with. Right, spending some more time in other spaces can help us really begin to understand and then respect some of those differences in the values of those. We want to be open to learning from others. If you're getting feedback from students saying, I really feel uncomfortable, or I feel like you're treating me differently from somebody else, our immediate response may be to say, oh no, that's not me. But what is more helpful, at least for the student in that moment, is to say, wow, I hadn't really considered that. Let's talk a little bit more about that, right? Being open to that, providing space for those hard conversations can really help address some of these bias issues. We want to take time to reflect on our feelings of discomfort. There's always going to be a time where you think to yourself, I probably could have handled that differently. Or, I feel really uncomfortable in this situation or speaking in front of these groups. Let me think a little bit more about why that might be. Right, taking some time to really reflect on your own practice will increase the likelihood that the next time you're in that situation, you've already thought through a little bit about how you would handle it differently. We want to question our snap judgments. Who are the kids that we're maybe kind of always interacting with in a negative way? And why is that? What are some of the assumptions that we're making? Who are the families that maybe we're constantly interacting with in a negative way? Our coworkers, right? Are there some judgments that you're making about their perspective, their point of view, their identity that might be clouding your way forward in terms of building a positive relationship and rapport? And finally, at the end of this presentation, we have some QR codes for you with some additional resources. There are many books, podcasts, video presentations that you can take a look at to begin to unpack a little bit about what is happening for you as the individual, and then how to share that with students, families, and community partners.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about restorative justice in schools, aka restorative practices. This is just coming from my research project team, and so Restorative Schools Project, and where I'm the principal investigator. So what is restorative justice in schools? And I think one of my favorite little illustrations is that to exemplify this point that there are many definitions, and so I was in another state. I was working on restorative justice, and we did a statewide retreat where we had all the practitioners come in the state who are doing restorative justice, and we tried to come up with a definition, a common definition. And after 2 days, we were unsuccessful. Okay. And so what does that tell you? Well, it tells me at least that there's a lot of different ways to do it in practice. Okay. And I want to suggest that that's actually a good thing. Okay. But the bad thing, the trade-off with that is that there's confusion in practice and confusion in then scholarship and the literature as well. And so, but since, since 2012, and then after 2016, it's been become more and more clear where there is much more of a consensus on the ground and in the scholar literature, okay? But just wanted to say that there are different definitions. And, one of the questions is one model is one model better than the others, right? And that's still an empirical question, okay? So just wanted to kind of set that context. So RJ in schools, or restorative practices, which is it's often called. If you look in the literature and if you just actually talk to people, And just like I was mentioning, there's all these different definitions. And so they vary based off of whether it's a program, is it an intervention, is it a specific strategy, how many components do you need to do? It's a philosophy. Other people are saying, oh, no, it's a way of life. And so here's what, in my opinion, what is representative of the literature and the practice. And so, and illustrative of best practice. So restorative justice in schools is a philosophy, okay? And the philosophy then is a belief system, okay? A view about the world, society, about schools, about kids, and how they work. And so they have principles. Okay, if you have a philosophy, then there's going to be some principles that come out of it. And if you look at the literature, there's a lot of different principles people are saying. If I were to say one term, what makes restorative justice in schools at a philosophical principle level different is that it's really about respectful relationships. Okay. And if I were to add, I would say respectful relationships in community. Okay. And so then that's really at its core, in my opinion, from my read and my practice. But to elaborate a little bit more, get a little bit more specific. So relationships then, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about respect for all persons. Okay. And kind of what, kind of referring back to the whole culturally responsible practice model, right? We need to see everybody as human. And see then we can see their strengths, okay? And so let's have true respect for the kids. And so, and sometimes there's beliefs that serve as obstacles to that, right? Maybe their belief is, well, the kids are kids and they don't deserve as much respect as the adults in the school, okay? And so then also the children's families deserve respect, okay? And so then that's the other part of relationships is that we want to focus on when there's conflict, we focus on harm that has occurred. Okay. Not, hey, you did this, this is what happened. You're the one who deserves the punishment. But hey, this occurred. How does this affect your relationships with this person? How does this affect your relationships with the school teacher, with the larger community? Okay, so that's what we mean by relationships. And then the other one is empowerment. So empowerment as a principle from the philosophy of restorative justice is critical because we want to make sure that all voices are empowered. So everyone has a voice at the table. And everyone has a voice in what to change, what should change, and growth. Okay, what should we do to improve? And then we also want to have equal stakeholders. Okay, that's also part of empowerment, or where that's much more egalitarian. Okay, and so think about this from a student perspective: is your classroom empowering of all kids and their families, right? And so you can see then how oftentimes in schools, and it kind of makes sense because we're adults teaching kids, that the adults have all the have more of a top-down approach, okay? And so then the other part is collaboration, right? So the third principle is collaboration. And what we mean by collaboration is just really broad and deep, okay? So we want to have mutual accountability, mutual involvement, all the stakeholders. So families, the kids involved, everyone who's involved in, say, a conflict needs to be there and give input, okay? And so and then this enhances responsibility for everyone involved. So you can see how if a child were to commit or do something that was harming another child, and then they were to sit and hear how that affected the other child and how that affected the peers who were watching. okay, and then how that may have affected the teacher as well, then a lot of that shared space, those shared understanding creates motivation for change. And then everyone decides together how to change. How do we make this right together as a community? And so that these principles then are what is at the base of the philosophy, which then leads to process of justice. And so what I mean by this is that it's really about procedures. How do we do these things? How do we address harm and conflict? How do we address, how do we make decisions? You know, Dr. Leverett was talking about implicit bias and decision making. How does this occur? Who's at the table? Who's empowered, right? And so, in this process of justice, and justice is really deep also, it's not just punitive justice that's often thought of in America, in the US, but it's about making things right and trying to heal. And so then this process of justice can be at a tier 1 level all the way up through a tier 3, but more of a tier 3 is what restorative justice is most commonly known for, okay? So then restorative justice, if you have these pieces together, then culture develops, okay? So these procedures or these behaviors or these strategies that occur in schools repeatedly over time that's consistent with this philosophy and principles are going to create a restorative culture, okay? And so, and this restorative culture, again, is going to permeate the whole school from tier 1 to tier 3, from adults, parents, families, and kids, and they will see through the processes of justice the principles and philosophy of respectful relationships in community played out over and over. And so then this is what is going to be the part of the school that really resonates with kids and adults as well. And so just wanted to go over that really quick. Okay, hang on. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of tech issues. Okay, so then just really quickly, you know, one of the favorite things is 40 to 90% reductions in exclusionary discipline. And essentially, just to sum it all up, across randomized controlled trials, policy analyses, and evaluations across the country and across the world, there's restorative justice has great promise, okay, to address, to enhance school climate, school culture, and to decrease punitive and exclusionary discipline, all right? And so just wanted to sum that up. All right, so then to get a little additional flavor for the difference between the punitive and exclusionary justice system that we have in the US and in schools, for the most part, that's linked to the zero tolerance policies that Dr. Leverett mentioned. And then restorative justice are these questions, and these are very common in the literature, and so very classic ones. And so the punitive justice, they're concerned with what rules or laws were broken, okay? And then, and on the other hand, restorative justice is saying who was harmed, what was the extent of the harm. On the punitive side, we always want to know who did it, who's the perpetrator, you know? And so on the restorative side is what are the needs that gave rise to the event? What were the needs of the person who committed some harm, and what was going on there? And on the punitive exclusionary side is what punishments does the perpetrator deserve, right? You do the crime, you do the time, okay? On the restorative side is how do we make this right again? How do we ensure that harm is repaired and relationships restored and prevented in the future? And so you can see how this is very different, okay, than what's currently going on in schools at a philosophical level, cultural level, and then processes, okay? And so then this is my last slide, and just to kind of throw in that, you know, as I mentioned earlier in the culturally responsive model, that we want to look at population based, right? So it's trying to address RJ, restorative justice, restorative practices at the whole school level. Okay. And so what that means then is that at tier one, we want to do what we can to develop that restorative culture. Okay. This would be kind of all the processes that are in place, whatever MTSS model you have for tier one. Okay. You can continue to do these things as long as it's consistent with the philosophy and principles for justice, which in most likelihood many are. Okay, and then at tier two, restorative circles. These are just examples. You don't have to do these. And then at tier three, or students who need additional support, we do conferences and reintegration circles. And so the arrows going up and down on each side, that signifies that it really is recursive, okay? So it's not necessarily that, yeah, tier one is critical, but then so are the other tiers because they all contribute to this restorative culture, right? So the justice processes need to be placed at all different tiers. And so I know Sam's gonna talk a little bit more about some of these, but just to say that restorative justice or restorative practices has a proactive or preventative side built in, okay? Many people think that it's only the tier three, right? And that's what, that's restorative practices claim to fame, okay? And so while that is true, we know that there's a recent study that has shown and demonstrated that schools who integrate restorative justice at an MTSS level consistently, okay, are going to receive better results regardless of the specific model, the specific strategies or interventions that they're choosing, okay? What matters is that it's integrated and it's consistent. And that's a good thing because in CCSD is very unique, population's unique, and the district's unique. And so there's, yeah, as I introduce Sam next, or Dr. Scavella, sorry, it's great to see that CCSD is doing just this, okay? They're doing an MTSS model and tailoring it to their own unique needs. All right, without further ado, Dr. Scavella.
Thank you, Dr. Song. I really appreciate that. And Dr. Leverett. So I want to start, when you think about CCSD, we need to get a context of what are we dealing with at CCSD. First of all, we're the 5th largest school district in the nation. We serve 310,000 students through, well, I would say across 366 schools. So we're a very large, very diverse population of students that we serve. And where we start in regards to restorative practices and the school law and how it looks in our schools, we have to begin with in the legal perspective. So in July of 2001, we had Assembly Bill 371 that became into law, that went into law and amended our Nevada Revised Statute 388, which extended the provisions of bullying and cyberbullying laws to additionally prohibit and address the discrimination based on race incidents. So anything that occurred as it relates to discrimination based on race now has to be addressed in the same manner that we address bullying and cyberbullying. And those revised, that revised statute actually amended policy 5137, which was our district policy that guides our safe and respectful learning environment. So this, when we think about discrimination based on race, I know the first thing is like, what is discrimination based on race? There's actually 3 parts to the definition of discrimination based on race. Firstly, it's defined as any single or repeated or pervasive act or acts, whether it's targeted to a specific person or targeted in general, and it's based on The second part is race, color, culture, religion, language, ethnicity, or national origin of a person that causes harm or creates a hostile working and learning environment. It also includes limitations in terms of jokes, threats, when you have a fight or you're trying to see students intimidating each other. And it could be online, it could be in person, or any other setting as it relates to education. All football games, it can happen even on social media. So again, a lot of things affect discrimination based on race. So there are some required actions that we have to look at when we think about discrimination based on race and this new law that went into effect in July. It requires school districts to categorize an incident as either a racially motivated incident or a hate incident. So here in the Clark County School District, we decided that we're going to focus on racially motivated incidents, because it's really hard if you look at elementary age students for someone to think about a hate incident for a elementary school student, because they're just not at that maturity level. They're not at the level where they could really internalize those feelings to be able to get to that point where they say they actually hate somebody or something. So we really are focusing on how do they learn that behavior, because all behavior is learned. So and then how are they applying that behavior when they're interacting with other students, their peers, or the adults in the buildings that they come in contact with. So there's a couple of other things I'm going to run through really quickly. The safety team provisions make sure that there's members of the community on that safety team in each school that is the same demographics as the students that we're serving. So if we're writing a safety plan for a student that's been exposed or been subjected to a racially motivated incident, that person who is on that team has to be the same demographic as the student who we're writing that safety plan for. We have to involve the parents, and then we have to take into account someone on that team who we can look at and say they have an expertise and cultural competency. So that's something else that we have to really look at that's required by the law. The next thing that was required by the AB 371 legislation that went into law is that the restorative, any actions that administrator takes, any actions to address racially motivated incident or a bullying or cyberbullying incident has to be based on restorative practices. So that's where it gets really, really important, and we have to really make sure that our administrators, our teachers, our school support staff, everyone is really well versed with restorative practices, and we're going to come to that in a second. And the last part of it is that the investigations, there has to be a process. There are required actions that schools have to take when they are investigating incidents of racially motivated incidents, bullying, and cyberbullying, and then it's really spelled out in policy 5137, and it's also referred to in policy 5139, which we're going to get to in just a second. So when we think about our schooling process, and we think, and you heard a lot about the disparities, and you heard a lot about what's going on in our classrooms or in classrooms across the nation in general, we have to start with these systemic barriers. In 2019, our superintendent, Dr. Jesus Ja, created the Student Equity and Access Advisory Commission. This commission was comprised of about 13 leaders throughout the community with diverse backgrounds, and they were charged to make sure that they made recommendations to the superintendent to ensure equity and access for all students. The commission concluded that there were 4 fundamental failures in our system here in Clark County School District. They demanded that we really look at these 4 what we call failure points, and we addressed them. So as you can see on the slide, we identify them as barriers leading to cycles of inequity. So with that, you have kindergarten access, you have magnet and programs and gifted and talented. So these were programs that certain students of color, when I say that, I'm talking about the Hispanic students, the Black African American students, they were underrepresented in these programs. Accelerated coursework in middle school, high school, AP, advanced credit, dual credit, CTE programs. So that's something that we had to address systemically. The work really was focused this year, at the beginning of this year. And what we had to do was we called in about 20 community partners, business partners, and we created a task force that focused on identifying how we're going to address these systemic barriers as taken into account the AB 371 law in regards to discrimination based on race. And we created a really great working collaboration. And we developed a policy that that rejected all forms of racism. It ensures that incidents of discrimination based on race are prohibited, and it functioned under 5 principles that focused on cultural diversity, removing systemic barriers, access, and or providing that access, and so that we can have those improvements in those academic areas. In regards to those 4 areas that I spoke to a little just a minute ago. And this policy 5139 was entitled Anti-Racism, Equity, and Inclusion. So with that work, I want to just quickly, we need to understand what happens when we get in schools. Many times when we get in schools, it's a focus on going directly to data-driven instruction. Let's get students in classes and let's focus on instruction. However, I want you to look at this slide. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That this concept, this theory, has been around since 1943. So what this visual gives you is that there are basic needs that a human that we have to experience as human before we can get to our psychological needs, and then we can get to our self-fulfillment needs. And if those basic needs in the order that's presented in this chart, and here's the concept, if those basic needs are not provided, then we can't move on to those other needs that gives us the opportunity to be fulfilled in our lives. So when we look at this, notice where the sense of belonging is. That's that third need. There are what we call those 3 levels. Those first 3 levels are the basic needs, and then those higher needs when it gets to esteem and self-actualization. But we cannot get there unless you have those 3 basic levels fulfilled, and then we can go to that next level. So notice where that sense of connection, friendship, family, group membership, all of that is the part that you heard earlier from my colleagues, and they're talking about those relationships, those connections that students have to have in school in order to get to the point where they can maximize their learning potential. So I'm not going to go into so much of restorative disciplinary practices, but I just want to focus on a few things there, and we can you can click about 3 more times real quick. And what you will see here, Dr. Song already talked about a lot of the concepts of restorative practices. What we're going to focus on is how we're implementing this in our schools here in Clark County School District. And we're going to focus on that whole school relational approach, because our concept is that you can't restore what you haven't built and sustained. So you have to build, sustain. Then if there is a breakdown, then you can repair and restore. But you can't restore unless you have first built it. And that's what we're talking about. And that's fostering that belonging, that those relationships in the classroom, those relationships throughout the school community. And then it doesn't have to be just the teacher. It's your administrators, it's your custodians, it's your cafeteria workers, it's your campus security monitors. It's everybody in that organization. So when you look at that relational approach, we're going to focus on what does that look like in a tiered system where we're taking care of the basic needs, but we're also pushing towards making sure that we have intentional relationships, and how do we build that sense of community in order to get the students to that higher level where we can experience improved academic achievement, where we can have reduction in suspensions, and certain populations of students do not have to be subjected to or show up more than other students in disciplinary data. So those are the things that we really need to focus on. Restorative practices gives us a way that we can begin to build those relationships, and it begins in the classroom. It begins and it's actually fostered even at home. So I'm going to show you a few things in terms of the continuum for restorative practices. Dr. Song already kind of touched on it, so I'm going to go really quickly to the effective statements. And this is a fluid implementation. It can happen in so many different areas and situations, and it moves on a continuum from informal to formal. So in the classroom, you would notice a lot of teachers using effective statements, and those are those personal statements that really indicate how the behavior is impacting not just themselves as a student, but other students in the classroom environment. How are we using those basic questions to really drive into, elicit the expressions of attitude, values, feelings? When situations occur, do we just write a referral, or do we are we able to, through our relationships, through our connection with students, able to have small conferences that we can problem solve? We can have community building circles in classrooms, and we can use these effective statements and questions to build those relationships in the classroom. As the process, you notice, as it gets more formal, then that means it gets more, we have to do more on the front end to really create an opportunity to set them up and do more work and in terms of pre-work to before we conduct those processes. So when we get to the group and the circle process, we're speaking more so as a versatile restorative practice, you know, that doesn't just focus on restoring, but it also focuses on building those relationships, that relational, that community building piece, until we get to that formal process in which that's when we really have to think about how are we structuring our meeting in order to include our entire, what we call community of care. And the community of care is not just the student, but it's actually the family, the friends of that student, on both the student who has caused the harm and the student who has been a recipient of the harm. So how do we have those conferences so that students can speak freely, students have a safe space to talk about the impact of those behaviors, to build on the responsibilities of those behaviors, which we identify as the 5 R's that, again, restorative practices is the foundation of, is the foundation of the entire concept or theory of restorative practices. And that's building relationships, that's communicating respectfully in a respectful manner, that's making sure that we are responsible, we're taking accountability for our actions, or holding the person who have committed the harm responsibility accountable for their actions. And we're exploring solutions to make things right in order to repair the harm that was caused, so that we can reintegrate the student back into the school population and that make sure that that behavior is not repeated. That's why we often, after formal conferences, we have an agreement, we put it in writing, so that the behavior is not repeated. Now, this is the training that's going on, that's going to begin next month in our district. Dr. Song, I know we're almost at the end, so I'm going to go really, really quick because I know we're close to. Are we scheduled to finish at 4?
Oh, you got about 10 more minutes, Sam.
Okay, I'll take maybe about 5 minutes, and then we'll get to some Q&A if we have time. So you can move to that next slide. Thank you. So if you can click through this slide, you will see that this is our whole school approach. We just wrote a grant for $1.86 million to work with our schools, partner with our schools, provide professional learning so that we can not only provide that the ground roots to what the concepts and how to implement restorative practices and utilize those processes, and how do we embed them in our school community to build relationships. Again, I want to keep reminding you that concept of building, sustaining those relationships. And then if there's a breakdown, then we have to really look at how do we repair and restore. So this is the whole school approach. We have the restorative practices. We're going to embed them with the professional learning. It's really important to look at the multi-tiered system of supports. You cannot, again, we have to first teach those behaviors. You're going to see that on the next slide. And then the trauma-informed teaching is so important because of the pandemic. So many of our students are still experiencing trauma from the pandemic. You heard Dr. Leverett talk about a lot of the implicit bias and the culturally responsive teaching that's really needed in order to make those connections for students to connect to their cultures, their languages, their life experiences in the classroom. And then we need to wrap our arms around our kids. So all of this is so important when we're talking about that whole school approach. And any breakdown in any one of these systems or processes creates concerns that, in which, again, when you think about that Maslow's, we really need to get to students to that point where they are focusing on their esteem and their actualization, but we got to take care of those basic needs, and those are all built around relationships. So if you look at this next slide, the multi-tiered system of support, you will see that there's a connection, and you see very clearly that the restorative processes that begin on the tier 1, and when you see that 1, that means that's school-wide. That happens every day. That's very consistent across the board, across the entire school community. But look at those tier 1 practices, being able to set those school-wide behavior norms, having classroom expectations and routines, making sure that we're looking at ongoing data and we're monitoring that piece. And we're going to, you'll see just in a minute or so, how important that is to use that data for us to drive decisions. And you cannot exclude the family from this equation, because that school-family partnership is that's paramount. We have to make sure that happens. And then how do you reinforce the behaviors you expect in order for all of the students to understand what the expectations are, meet those expectations. It may have to start extrinsically until it becomes an intrinsic goal, an intrinsic motivator to make sure that kids are really taking ownership and self-managing themselves in order to experience really a gratification of what education presents and provides for all of our students. So if you look at the restorative, you will see in each of the different tiers, you'll see that continuum that I spoke on just a minute ago, from what is our preventive practices that happen system-wide, school-wide, in terms of building those relationships, and then what are those targeted interventions and intense interventions when we look at individualized supports that students need, not just academically, but mentally, behaviorally, socially as well. So again, it's all built around relationships. And this last slide I want to kind of show you is once we are looking at, we have to make sure that we have systems and structures in our schools so that the data, we can look at how, when we develop a plan, we're looking at the current data, and we're looking at exactly what are the implications of this data in terms of our school practices and the processes that we have to serve our students. So once we have those plans, and we really have a process that gives principals and school administrators an opportunity to plan these different structures out, and it's our school performance planning, then once we implement it, how do we kind of look at collecting that data, analyzing it, looking at qualitative and quantitative data, and then how do we reflect on the results of what we're seeing from the implementation process to be able to know if it's being successful or not, and then to make those next steps, those correct actions, so that, again, we can make sure that kids, all of our students, are reaching that self-actualization where they're maximizing their learning potential on a daily basis. So that's what we're doing in Clark County School District. We're doing it incrementally. It's a 3 to 5 year process plan to make sure that this these practices are happening across all 366 schools. And again, students are coming to school with a sense of belonging, and they have strong connections and relationships with not just each other, but with adults in every building.
Great, thank you, Dr. Scavella. So here's just some resources that Dr. Leverett had referenced earlier. I'll leave it here so you could scan those, take pictures of that. And so at this point, also, we have questions, Q&A. So again, I'll leave it there. So feel free to ask a question either through the chat system, or I think you could raise your hand as well. And we'll just all chime in on those questions as we see fit. So.
Thank you so much. This has been very interesting. I wanted to find out if there is any tangible, Dr. Scavella, is there any tangible numbers that we see pre and post so far? I know it's kind of early, but I don't know if you all have been tracking numbers to see the impact of the new law and your department, what you've been doing.
That's an excellent question, Pastor Ivy. Actually, we are monitoring monthly our numbers in terms of the law requires that we identify how many bullying, cyberbullying, racially motivated incidents. So we actually do that for all of the behavior events in the district, and we do that on a monthly basis. So we have been seeing incidents of racially motivated incidents. We have been seeing incidents of bullying. The bullying is a little more than, it's kind of like the one infraction that we see more common, but we have seen a reduction in it. We are noticing that in the first semester, we probably have had multiple racially motivated incidents that have occurred. And we look at it individually per school as well as per region. Our district is broken down into 3 regions that consist of about 107 to about 130 schools. So we look at it regionally. Then we look at it at a level basis as well. So we look at elementary, middle, and high school, so that when we're working with our school, with our region leadership team and our school principals, we can collaborate around what's the best next steps that we need to do in order to impact that data and make sure that students understand the expectation for behavior, and they're meeting those expectations in every school. So yes, we do look at those numbers on a regular basis, monthly, and that's required by law.
Thank you, Dr. Scavella. One last follow-up question. How does the school district help make parents more responsible in these actions? We've seen, specifically in Minnesota, where we had death to happen because parents gave a child a gun, and that child brought it to school and killed 4 students there, tragically. But the state attorney general made it very clear that the parents were responsible and charged them as well. What are we doing here to help, number one, prevent such things? I think Dr. Linda Cavazos has helped with that, but more importantly, I guess the question would be, what are we doing afterwards when we find these incidents, both elementary, middle school, and high school? What are we doing with parents to help have that responsibility at their kitchen table to prevent further incidents?
So it's a few things that we are doing. Again, that's required by the new law that we do when we address bullying, cyberbullying, or racially motivated incidents, or any of the behavioral infractions that may occur that violate the code of conduct. We have to include the parent at the beginning. The first thing is we have to stop the behavior, and every administrator has been trained. Every school administrator, we have over 920 school-based administrators in our district. They all have been trained. They all have went through follow-up training on restorative practices. They went through training in regards to the investigatory process and how to what are the expectations and what is the procedures. We developed a checklist that has links to resources so that they can, once they get into the investigation and either it could be a safe voice or somebody reports it, the first action they need to do is to stop the behavior. So once they stop the behavior, then they identify who are what are the roles that the students have played in that incident, and then they have to write a safety plan at the beginning of the investigatory process in order for schools to make sure that students are safe during the investigation process. So they write the safety plan, and they cannot do that without parent involvement. So that makes sure that parents at the beginning of this entire process are involved through the entire process. Parents, even at the end, has to receive a report, and it has to identify what are the results of the investigation as it relates to their child, and then what restorative practices were used or are planned to use to address their behaviors. And it has to address not just the students, again, who are classified as the victims, but it also has to be utilized to address those students who are also the people who are causing a harm that we sometimes look at and classify as offenders. So that whole process is a 5-step process. It involves different central office departments and divisions, if appropriate. And again, it makes sure, and it also involves law enforcement if necessary. So these things have to be in place. It's required in terms of the safety plan. And then at the end of the investigatory process, they have to revisit the safety plan to make sure that all students moving forward after that investigation is completed are safe. And then there's always a 10-day follow-up. And that is really, really important to make sure that those behaviors are not being repeated in the schools.
There's a question in the chat about where to start. So in terms of engaging staff in conversations about restorative justice, since it can sometimes be difficult to get teachers to engage in conversations about things like PBIS. So how do you start the conversation in schools around restorative justice?
But the conversations really start with relationships. I mean, what's good for every student is to make sure that there's intentional structures and strategies being used to build relationships. So where we start is we start with relationships. We start with the relational part of the restorative practices to build the community. We start with the professional training that we're doing. We're starting next month, looking at what's the foundational knowledge base and skills that we need to provide through professional learning for all students, I should say for all teachers, and then you involve students in that process as well. So you start with identifying what are the needs, and one thing that a lot of schools need to focus on, and we really are focusing on this as well, is looking at the core values and beliefs in each school community. What are those core values and beliefs that drive everything that you do should come from your core values and beliefs, and that should be reflected in every process and every aspect of the school. And that has to be around, relationship building, relationship sustaining, because if you don't build and sustain relationships, you won't have anything to restore when it's time to focus on repairing harm that has been done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with Dr. Scavella. I would just add, in my experience, what I've seen also helpful is the principal needs to create some time in the schedules to have some discussions. So the structure needs to be in place. Yep. And engagement in the restorative practices for staff is critical. And so that would include engagement by the administrator and teachers in modeling some of these practices. They need to experience it themselves, and they'll really feel the benefits. So I would also just add to that, to what Dr. Scavella said. All right, so Caitlin, okay. Caitlin Watson, you had your hand up, but I see that you put the question in the chat. So I can read it for everybody. No contact contracts are a frequent resource used for students who engage in physical or verbal altercations. Do you think that will go away as a resource within CCSD as we continue to move forward with RJ practices and focus more on restorative circles between students? That's the question. Sounds like that's for Dr. Scavella.
Okay. Again, when I talked about the process of investigating these incidents that occurred, the first thing that we have to do is stop the behavior. So those no contact contracts is, I kind of look at them as just a Band-Aid to stop the bleeding for now. Okay, so you have to stop that behavior. Those are just practices that are very temporary until you have the opportunity to meet with both students. And we always suggest that you meet with them individually because they have different needs. They have different backgrounds. They have things that may have prompted those behaviors that we have to address individually first. So that process, that restorative practices process, always begins with a pre-meeting on both the victim and the offenders. And then you get to the point where you're ready to have a fully restorative conference, whether it be a circle or just a formal conference. But it's one you really have to focus on addressing the root cause of the behavior. So I want us to look at behavior as communication. Okay, so if behavior is a form of communication, then how we address the behavior is a form of what? Teaching. So it's all within the teaching and learning process. So what are we trying to teach our students about certain incidents and conflicts and how they address these conflicts? But what are students trying to convey to us that is shown a lot of times non-verbally in their behavior. So the behavior is communicating a lot of times what students are trying, they can't communicate verbally. So, or they struggle with that piece until they learn those skills. And a lot of times that's when you see those fights. That's when you see those physical altercations and those other things, because they are communicating something and then we have to respond correctly, and we have to teach them how to communicate differently and use non-physical means to get to a particular end in which they're trying to pursue. So our behavior is usually to get something or get away from something, and we need to look at the functions of those behaviors. So yes, those no contact contracts, those are just to stop the behavior until we can get to the point where we can address those behaviors through these processes and practices.
Yeah, and as we're talking about learning, I think that it's so important, right? The teaching aspect. We can't expect people to engage in behaviors that we haven't explicitly discussed or taught or set our expectations around. In the same way that we do that with children, we are also doing that with our colleagues, right? With the adults in the space. So one of the comments in the chat was, I've been in behavior meetings where we fill out RJ forms, but have no idea of the concepts regarding RJ, right? Like the key components or structures. And I think that gets back to, sometimes some of these policies come out before you really get a chance to engage in the professional development and the training. And so what Dr. Scavella is talking about now is really intentionally thinking about some of these guiding concepts and structures before you kind of dive in. Oftentimes we find that people maybe want to get a jump start on certain interventions, but because it's murky in the beginning about kind of how it's set up, people give up before we even get started, right? So it's really important to take time to make sure you're scheduling those professional developments as you're thinking about some of these concepts.
Any additional questions? Are we missing any in the chat or anything? Let me see. Looking over the hand raises, but
yeah, I was trying to see that we address all of the questions that were in the chat.
I think we have. Anyone else want to ask us anything else?
And I just want to just mention something that Dr. Leverett said is so important. Again, and Dr. Sam touched on, Dr. Son touched on it as well. This is not a quick process. Restorative practices, when done with fidelity, usually could take up to 3 to 5 years to do them correctly and to make it into embed those processes throughout your entire school community. We used, in my experience as a school administrator, and you heard that I've been doing this work for quite a few years here. We even use those to restore. We use circles, community circles, in our professional development with our teachers to teach, to strengthen teachers' instructional core around their knowledge and skill level to be able to develop learning tasks that align to the content and rigor level of standards being taught. So again, that's a process that we can also use in this work. So it doesn't just have to be used because a student has misbehaved, but these processes are used when you're having staff meetings. You can open up with a beginning circle in the staff meetings to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to begin on a positive note in your staff meetings. You can utilize it in student-led processes. In one of the schools, we had a lot of high schools have student governments. So we had a community, what we call a student town hall for every grade level, and we did that every single month. And by year 3, the students were leading those town halls. The students were leading those conversations. Those students were leading the circles. that we were having. We had advisory period for 20 minutes every single day. Those students began leading those questions during those circles. Those students were identifying what questions and how they were functioning. And it's just, it's so many different ways that you can utilize these processes and embed them in your culture, but it just is not going to happen overnight. You have to have a good foundation. You have to have professional learning. And then you have to practice them, because you don't have to be great to get started, but you have to be get started to be great. So that fear is something that holds us back sometimes. When we're not comfortable, we don't try the practices because we're not comfortable with it. And it's okay. Progress, performance, and achievement does not live in the zone of comfort. So I've learned that also in these few years I've been doing this work.
Great wisdom. Thank you, Dr. Scavella. And you have a former, I don't know if it's a employee or a student, but Quinn Bell.
Yeah, I see some good comments here. What is that one from Jennifer? You want to read that one, Dr. Song?
She's just saying at this point, schools do not have a solid replacement for the old way of doing things. And I'm looking forward to RGA practices taking root in CCSD. So.
Oh, yes. Oh,
yeah.
yes. These are exciting times. We're going to,
yeah.
This is the time for us to really come together with our community partners, with our families, and especially with our students, to build those relationships. Everything is based on intentional methods. And as you heard Dr. Leverett say, is so important, systems and structures dictate behavior. If you do not have the system and structure in place, then you do not have a good grasp of what that behavior is going to look like, whether it be student or adult behavior. So that's something we just want to, I just wanted to piggyback on Dr. Leverett's suggestion about in that area.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Scavella, I'll also read, Quinn Bell wrote, Dr. Scavella, you are an originator of this work. I graduated under your leadership and saw and felt firsthand these approaches. I currently lead an all-boys school in Brooklyn, New York, and this discussion has fueled me for the work ahead. Thanks for sharing your knowledge.
Quintarius, oh my God.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I know. He won the Steve Harvey National Award, and he took a trip to Orlando when he was a student under when I was a principal in Georgia.
Nice.
And I believe he's a principal now in New York or something like that. Or did Quinn, are you a principal now? Are you still there?
Quinn's there.
There he is.
Hey, I'm here.
So what are you doing in New York now, Quinn?
I'm a principal at an all-boys charter school. I've been leading now for the past 4 years.
Nice.
Man, this is so rewarding. I did not expect this. Thank you for attending, Quinn. I
Of
really
course.
appreciate it. Oh man, we have to talk. We have to talk.
Yes, let's connect, Dr. Scavella.
Absolutely.
All right. Dr. Leverett, you want to read the quote of the day and close this?
I just really liked, you don't have to be great to get started, but you have to start to become great. So thank you for sharing that, Dr. Scavella. I wanted to make sure we had that as our closing thoughts. If there are any other questions that didn't come up today, well, we're at time now, feel free to reach out to any one of us and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. But again, thank you so much for making time. We know that we are all kind of Zoom fatigued. And so the fact that you're here shows that you're committed to this work and thinking about these topics. This was recorded, and so it'll be posted on the website. And then we'll be able to share that with all of you who attended today so that you can share that with others if you feel that would be a benefit. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Bye-bye.